So Adam, perhaps I could begin with you, and perhaps as we start, you might share your screen and bring the article up. I imagine that a large number of the participants have had a chance to look at the article through the links in the event notification itself. But to start with, Adam, tell us a little bit about Starling Lab and its role and its purpose, and how this article came about.
Sure. Well, first of all, thank you very much for having me and for discussing a very important topic and set of topics, really. It starts from the underlying issues that Ron, captured that day in Bijelina and the concerns about accountability ever since. And then it dovetails today with modern technologies that were involved in telling this version of the story, and even takes a role in looking at how artificial intelligence addresses some very serious concern, or creates some very serious concerns around authenticity and trust in photography. So I'm very glad to have an opportunity to discuss this. Starling Lab was co-founded by Stanford University's Electrical Engineering Department and the USC Shoah Foundation, which is known for doing research on a number of genocides, most originally with the Holocaust, but then looking at other incidents, including what happened in Bosnia and Herzegovina. And so the lab itself is focused very heavily on technologies, in particular those that have been associated with Web3. We're talking about cryptography. We're talking about use of decentralized systems, blockchains, to create immutable evidence that can last for generations. And so the program started its first cohort of journalism fellowships last year, and partnered with a number of major media outlets on stories that we felt had really important evidence or opportunities to preserve materials that might be vulnerable. And with this particular story, Sophia Jones, who was with Starling Lab at the time and also working with Rolling Stone as a freelancer, started looking into incidents involving war crimes, and in particular, images that might have had people denying them or challenging their authenticity for some reason, or manipulating them. Taking them out of context, and wanting to make sure that we could find a way, using the technologies that the lab deploys, to try and add additional information, metadata, about these photos, working with the people who were originally involved. And everything, this actually predated me. I joined the lab last year, so her original research predates me, but everything, I think, came together really nicely with this particular story, and being able to identify an image that is just so iconic, that is so important and as part of a critical conflict, and a situation where the story needed to be told with an eye towards what has happened, not just with the incident that occurred, but also with the photo ever since.
And that's one of the things we're going to focus on, is the fact that this photo, taken in 1992, continues to circulate, continues to be used in multiple contexts, which is why authenticity is a challenging issue for it. Ron, coming to you, perhaps you could explain sort of how you came to be involved in this particular project, this particular investigation and use of the photograph through Starling Lab and Rolling Stone.
Well, I was approached by Sophia, who basically explained what Adam had just said, and that she was interested in diving deeper into the photograph, as well as what Starling Lab trying to do about this authenticity of imagery, which is obviously was an important conversation 2 years ago, and now obviously, as we're all even more aware of AI and deep fakes and so on, even more important. So I was definitely interested in trying to find ways that I could establish the veracity of the photograph, that it would not be disputed, and then of course to be interested in understanding any other levels of information connected to the photograph that Sophia was able to provide through her investigative journalism.
And can you tell us a little bit about how the photograph and where the photograph is circulated since it was taken? Because it is probably one of the most circulated photographs that you've probably produced over time. It's used in and misused in a variety of contexts.
Well, the photograph is from the breakup of the former Yugoslavia, which was a series of wars that occurred in the 1990s. And the war in Bosnia was the third war in the breakup of the former Yugoslavia. And I had been in the region trying to document the end of the Croatian War, which had just ended, when a colleague of mine had gotten a call that some fighting had started across the border in Bosnia, in this town bordering Serbia and Bosnia called Bijeljina. And the tensions at that point were very high, a lot of rhetoric, and people were not sure if they were going to be able to avoid war or not. And when I arrived in this town, the town had become split between Bosnian Serbs and Bosnian Muslims fighting against each other, the townspeople fighting against each other, the baker fighting against the butcher, the school teacher, shooting at the banker, and so on. By the third or fourth day of fighting, I was there on the Serbian side when a convoy arrived with a paramilitary group known as the Tigers, who had, in the previous war in Croatia, gotten a very serious reputation about being very vicious, very hardcore, organized, and led by this man known as Arkan. He was a legend in some ways. Was a bank robber. He escaped from prison in Sweden. He was an assassin for Tito and various other things, and was connected to a football club called Red Star in Belgrade, and had basically started this unit to be a defender of Serbs and to be one that would protect Serbs against everything else. And so he arrived in this town, and I had taken this photograph of him with this baby tiger, which was their mascot, a few months earlier than when I met him in Bijelina. And he remembered the photograph. He had liked the photograph. He made it into a poster. And so I'd asked him if I could go off with his unit as they went to, in his words, cleanse the town of Muslim fundamentalists. And off we went. We never found any fighters, but what we did find in the center of town, in a mosque, we found a terrified young man, a Kosovar Albanian who was hiding, who they took prisoner. And then across the street, there were people hiding in the basement, which you can see here, the wall of this compound of this building. Behind there were a number of civilians hiding in the basement, and they were pulling civilians out one by one. And the first people that were brought out were the Pajetis, a married couple from Macedonia who were working there on Bijeljina. And the couple was shouting, the soldiers were shouting, they were telling me not to take any photographs. And some shots rang out, and the husband, Abdurrahman, who you see here on the left, fell to the ground, and his wife, Hamieta, tried to save him. And moments later, she was shot. They then brought out another woman, Asya Shabanovic, known as Tifa, and then they shot her as well. And even though I had this photograph with Abdurrahman and Hamieta kind of trying to save them, and another photograph of the three of them lying, I needed to have a photograph with the paramilitaries and their victims in the same photograph, so I could prove beyond a shadow of a doubt what was happening, which was, to my mind, obviously a war crime. There was nothing that I felt that I could do. They knew I was there. I was there with them. They were telling me not to take photographs, and so they didn't care that I was there. And so since I couldn't do anything to save them, I needed to make sure that there was a document of what happened. And at the end of kind of this whole scene, the soldiers were leaving, and I just wanted to get a photograph of them walking in front of the bodies. And I framed it this way. It's a very narrow street. I was maybe 15 feet away or so. And the soldier came from my left, and then you see him with a cigarette in one hand, the sunglasses on his head, casually bringing his boot back as the victims. In fact, we think that at least one of them was still alive at that point. And I managed to take this photograph.
Sorry, when you took this photograph, as you say, you wanted something that showed the paramilitaries in the image as well. What did you hope this photograph would do at the time you took it? And what do you think the photograph did at the time that you took it and it was first published?
Well, a few months earlier during the war in Croatia, I was in a town called Vukovar, which had fallen to Serbian forces. And as it was being ethnically cleansed, a Serbian paramilitary pulled a civilian out of a line and just shot him. And as I raised my camera, because there's nothing I could do to stop it from happening, I wanted to at least get evidence. So I raised my camera to photograph it, and the guy put a gun to my head and said, "If you take a picture, we'll kill you." And so I wasn't even able to even walk out of there with evidence of what had happened. And I said, if I was ever in the situation again and there was no opportunity to influence the situation for the better, I had to make sure at least I walked out with evidence. So I was very determined to ensure that I would at least be able to tell the story and back up what I had witnessed with visuals. And therefore, if it was just victims, they could say they were killed by Muslims. And if it was just them, they would say, well, they didn't do anything. So I really wanted that photograph to at least tie them together and to be identifiable to some degree. When the photograph was first published, it was published by, and actually, just to be clear, this is on April 2nd. April 6th is kind of the official day of the beginning of the war, when Sarajevo had a peace march and was attacked. So these are among some of the first people to die in the war in Bosnia before it was sort of officially begun. And I had hoped when the photographs were going to be published, which they were by Time and Perry Match and Stern, that it would be enough evidence to galvanize the world into action. There were already UN troops on the ground in the area to act as a peacekeeping force for the previous war. And all the rhetoric that was happening from politicians, from pundits and so on was, Bosnia, if it happens, is going to be very, very brutal. And I thought, great, not great, but here is actual evidence of unarmed, middle-aged civilians being executed by well-armed paramilitaries. What more do you want? This should be the sort of the straw that broke the camel's back, the little pebble that pushes it over. That's what I was originally hoping that these photographs would do. The photographs did absolutely nothing. There was relatively no reaction to the photographs, and the war started and then lasted for almost 4 years, with thousands being killed, millions becoming refugees, and leading to another war in Kosovo. And today, of course, Bosnia is a dysfunctional country. Has not been able to get past the war from the 1990s. So the photograph really failed in its initial attempt to do anything.
But that failure is something that's produced by other circumstances, other relationships, other concentrations of power. It's not a failure that's down to the image itself.
No, and I'm not a photographer who believes that one photograph can change a war or stop a war, but I do believe that what we do as photographers can play a role in this process of communication, in this process of information, in this process of being able to educate, warn, raise awareness, and so on. And even in that extent, it took quite a while for the life of this photograph to start to increase, to actually have some power, which it did and does to some degree today.
Yeah. Just one technical question on this photograph from Ted in the audience. I mean, you were embedded with this paramilitary unit.
Right.
You were openly photographing. Did you raise the camera to your eye to take this picture? Did they know that you were taking this picture, or did you have to take it a little bit surreptitiously?
No, this photograph, I was standing in the middle of the street, camera to my eye, But as you can see in the photograph, nobody's looking at me.
Right.
So I took the photograph, put the camera down. They turned and looked at me. I gave them a big smile, and I said, "Let's go." And we ran to join the other soldiers who had already left. So they didn't know that this photograph was being taken. I think it was, I was shaking. I was quite sure that if they had seen me taking the photograph, because these guys, and I don't know who actually pulled the trigger, so I'm not saying that any of these 3 soldiers are the ones that killed them. They could have been, but everybody who was there was very, very nervous and very tense. So it would have been very easy for them to have killed me and just said, "Oh, the Muslims killed him," and left me there. Yeah. So, but I was pretty determined that I wanted to live up to what I made a promise to myself, to make sure that this was if I was in a situation like this, to make sure I walked out of there with a document.
Yeah. So Adam, we're now 30 plus years on from the taking of this photograph. For you, thinking about what Starling Lab does, what are the issues around determining the veracity of this image and why are they significant?
Sure. So I should give a very brief background. That I've been in journalism in the media business for about 20 years and have been in positions editorially where I'm not a photographer myself, but I have made a lot of decisions about what photos get attention in what places. And this image itself is, both from a historical perspective, but also just from an in-the-moment perspective, an incredibly stunning image. And so when I joined Starling Lab and this project was already underway, the concerns around the photo had only grown, and the newsworthiness of this photo had in many ways continued to grow. It was in some ways a cold case, but in some ways very reminiscent of other incidents that we've seen in history repeating over the globe in other conflicts. Some not very far from the Balkans, and in particular with the Russian invasion of Ukraine, where civilians faced great risks, where there were arms people going into civilian areas, and questions about how can we as a society look for accountability. And that's why this story was so important, because there wasn't very much accountability. And so 30 years on, there are 2 important threads here. One is the accountability side and the investigation that went into that, and I'll discuss that in a moment. And the other side of that is how technology has advanced. And so, probably everyone on this call uses Photoshop or something similar for cropping, for color correction, for very permissible edits in a newsroom sense. But there are certainly concerns around the manipulation of photos for abusive reasons, mis and disinformation. And so the idea in the last few years that has really risen throughout a number of different communities in the photography world and in the journalism world in general is around authenticity and provenance, which is exactly the set of areas that Starling researches. And so I'll jump back to maybe talking a little bit about the history and things that had gone on with the people who appeared to have been involved. Arkan's tigers were mentioned in a number of war crimes tribunals, the ICTY, and a lot of this evidence or a lot of material was available from those war crimes tribunals on their archive website if you knew really where to poke around. But the reporter in this story had reached out and asked for some of this material and was told that it was, I forget if the term was confidential or classified. But we knew that there was material out there, including payroll documents, which she had discovered, and wanted to make sure to preserve that because it named a number of very interesting names around this, not necessarily just this incident, but the larger involvement of Arkan's tigers and the Serbian state security forces. In addition to that, when she started looking into several of those names, at least 10 of them were still connected to this day on social media, friends on Facebook, commenting on each other's Instagram posts. And that material as well, talk about anything being vulnerable and subject to disappearing. You think about social media posts and how if someone sets their account to private, or if they delete a post, or let's just say a CEO is feeling mercurial that day, anything could be subject to disappear. And so as a lab, one of our focuses is on how do you preserve that in a way that not only establishes the veracity of that as an authentic image or social media post or whatever it may be, but also how do you preserve that in a long-term sense. So we started looking at this in terms of how we could apply all sorts of different things to capture and preserve this accumulation of digital content, which pointed towards some, unfortunately, what became familiar names. And many people who were part of this larger group went on to be associated with other serious crime allegations, with other very serious incidents. At least a couple of them who were found on those payroll documents, and not necessarily that those individuals were in Bijelina, but who were part of this this group apparently. That some of them seem to go on and join or be part of the Night Wolves, which is an infamous Russian motorcycle gang, which supported Russia's invasion of Crimea and has been sanctioned by both the European Union and the U.S. Treasury Department and penalized for its involvement in that particular conflict. And so, 30 years later, there were these echoes of impunity and a question of, well, if people weren't stopped then, why would they be stopped later? And does it send any message to anyone about how there's no risk or there's no accountability? I mean, that's a very scary thought. So with the technologies that had advanced in all of those years, we had some really interesting opportunities to figure out how do we preserve and show what is the authentic version of all of this. What are the authentic versions of Ron's images, because there are more than this one, which we'll get to in a moment. And also, how do we preserve, whether it's the payroll documents that were surfaced in the ICTY tribunal, or whether it's the social media connections that these individuals had. So in the case of the photographs, when you use a film camera, you may type onto the film slide certain pieces of metadata. And when we talk about metadata from the lab's perspective, it's just data about data. It's additional information. And everyone, I'm sure, probably on this conference is familiar with certain amounts of EXIF data, date and time, location. In some cases, data becomes more robust in terms of what type of lens is being used, what the aperture is, things like that. Well, with film, there's only so much material. And so when a photo can take on a life of its own as social media and the internet allows material to spread and have, claims made about it, which may be false in some cases, it's really a neat thing that happened here, where Ron wanted to ensure that he could, stand by the integrity of his work and help preserve this in hopes of accountability. And we've seen some movements towards that, which is something I'll tease right now, and we can discuss in a little bit. So Ron was involved with our team and researchers who sat down and rescanned these images. And so to the pixel, we're able to use cryptography and authenticate that this entire thing is the original version from Ron's original film slides. And one of the things that has been sort of good and bad about the timing of all of this is when I say the word crypto in my head, I think cryptography, a field that has been around for thousands of years that Stanford professors teach. And a lot of people hear crypto and they think, oh, cryptocurrencies, isn't that how people are trying to make a quick buck? And so we look at this very much as the traditional sense of that term, where cryptography in its classic sense was the art of telling secrets in public, that something was, think about Enigma machines from World War II, and you think about the Caesar cipher thousands of years ago, where people would wrap letters around a scroll to try and, obscure what the original words were, and you have to know the right size of the scroll to wrap it around and come up with the correct word. Well, so the idea of that actually works in two ways. Not only can you tell a secret in public, and most people won't understand it unless they have the key to decrypt it, you can also sign things to authenticate them, to show that if you have the original part of that, basically a long code, that you can then, using a publicly available formula that anyone can inspect, you can create essentially a certificate of authenticity. And you can sign anything in the digital world, which is what's great about this. So when you think about data, anything is a 1 or a 0. That's what bits are. It's just a number 1 or a number 0. But there's these very long strings of 1s and 0s. So with a bit of text, each letter gets converted into 1s and 0s. With a photograph, each pixel gets converted into ones and zeros. These are probably very familiar concepts to most people. So there's nothing magic about this. There's just something very profound and fundamental about these technologies. So
just to be clear on one point though. So Ron, you took these photographs using slide film in an analog camera, correct?
Yes, these were taken with a camera, I think it was the N1 at the time.
Right.
Fujichrome 100, pushed one stop to 200. Right. This particular frame with the 70 to 200.
Right.
Or 80 to 200, I think was the lens at the time.
Right. And then Adam, you're scanning those slides to make a digital file and then using this process of cryptography to say that what has been scanned is pixel by pixel what is in the original film slide. Is that correct?
Exactly right. And Ron's actually the one who was there helping to make this possible by literally, I think, Ron, you were the one pressing the button as these were scanned. There's a video on this website. If anyone wants to go to, it's investigation.rollingstone.com. And that, I think right now it's auto directs to the full story, where you can actually see this process, and it's very carefully done. There are bellows set up so that the slides can be inserted, and Ron's the one who's making sure everything is correctly set up. And then from the cryptography side of that is where our lab employed a number of different technologies. And the idea, there was I think it was a Canon, gosh, I want to say like an R5 or something, that was used as part of this. Pardon?
No, that's correct.
No, that is okay. And so that was used to actually, that was the sensor that the light was actually hitting when this image was scanned. That camera was being paired with a phone that has essentially a cryptographically secure wallet, if you want to think about the crypto sense of that. But it was able to sign, as I mentioned before, using these cryptographic technologies, and to create an attestation that we could then find a way to preserve. And so cryptographically, let's say that someone changes a single pixel of this image that's on screen right now. If they run that changed image through the math formulas that we use, and again, these are publicly available, anyone can use them, it creates essentially a digital fingerprint. And it's a identifying number, which is unique to this image. And when one pixel is changed, it will produce a radically different number, a different fingerprint. And so you can compare the two and see, well, these don't match anymore. Something was changed here. And it could be something as simple as changing the saturation, the hue, the crop. So any change would produce a completely different fingerprint and prove that it was not the original image. But we're also able to link each step, and so take a fingerprint of each version, so that when something is given what we would consider permissible edits, we're able to look more closely at each one that was made. So if you go to this image here in the story, any single image you see will have an eye icon, which includes what we refer to as an authentication certificate. And if you scroll down, there's a lot of additional metadata that was produced around this. If you click Inspect Asset, though, that pops open a new screen, and it takes the original file that was scanned with Ron, and also the changes that were made to set this up in Photoshop in a way that anyone would do. So if I go to here on the side, and by the way, this is a third-party site set up by the Content Authenticity Initiative, CAI, which many people may be familiar with. Adobe is a major entity behind it. You can see this particular version of the photo, which when it was scanned, you have a black border all around it from the actual physical, I think, like paper, cardboard that's on the slide. And so if you go up here, you can see the crop that was made. You can see it was done in Photoshop. And Adobe supports what are called content credentials. And so if anyone is using Photoshop today, you can go in, you can turn this on, and the content credentials follow a standard known as C2PA, which at this point, I think over 1,000 different entities have signed on to support. And so that ranges from software companies like Adobe, hardware companies like Sony, Nikon, Leica, and news outlets, I think Washington Post, BBC. So over 1,000 different entities are supporting this particular set of open standards. And so this embeds additional data about any potential change that was made in Photoshop. And on this one, so you have a crop and there's some very, very slight color correction here. And so it's almost imperceptible. The photo I tend to use when I show this is this process here is this example here, which is another photo that Ron took and scanned. And if I go to, it might be hard to see because this is a streaming webinar, but if you look at the sky in the background here, you can see maybe where it's a slightly lighter tone in the edited version of this. And with any photo that's done, whether it's with Photoshop or anything else that supports C2PA, you can do inspections where you can compare these different versions of it. And so you can do it with a slider, which as I'm sliding, at least on my screen, and again, because it's barely been touched at all, you wouldn't see that much of a difference, but you can maybe see in that sky a slight difference as I slide it over. And you can also do side-by-side comparisons. So you can imagine that when people do more profound changes that might be something that people might want to question, that if you compare this side by side or with a slider, you're able to identify what has been done to the image. Well, in the case of these ones, we wanted to establish that really nothing fundamentally was changed. This is Ron's original work. And so throughout this entire story, an archive was set up where you can go and inspect literally every asset that's displayed. And that includes Ron's images, that includes additional images that were taken during the last year or so as part of the investigation. It includes payroll documents that you see here, and it includes these web crawls where additional work was done in the authenticity space to figure out how would we redact some of this. So, there might be people commenting on Facebook posts, or actually I'll pull up one right here, where you can see where we blurred out certain areas. And so the process of blurring that, and obviously there are fully blurred versions where everything about it is blurred because we want to show what the original image is and that it was authentic, but we don't want to reveal people who maybe are unrelated to the investigation and commenting. Similarly, on payroll documents, there are signatures of people who were not subject to the investigation, and we didn't want to show someone's signature or someone's name who maybe was completely unrelated to the investigation. So this is where even more technology was pulled in, and similar sorts of things can absolutely be done with photographs, whether they're film that's been converted or whether they're taken on a digital camera today.
Adam, can you take us through, say, even here where you've got this authentication certificate, the various sections? What are the various sections in this certificate showing? And
sure.
How is that securing the integrity of those particular images?
Yeah, let me jump back to maybe that top image, just because that's the one I tend to use the most in
Sure.
As a demonstration. So I'm most comfortable with the pieces here, but it's the same principle for all of these. With any image in a digital camera, let me start with that because I think maybe especially for folks, some younger folks who are just so used to that and used to the metadata that comes with it. It's pretty intuitive that you might capture date and time, that you might capture GPS coordinates, but then you can also add any amount of metadata. You can add a caption, you can add certain bits of information, and so some of this is manually added, and so that includes information like the description and the caption. A CID is a way of finding this photo as it's been preserved on the distributed web. And so one of the things I think that was important, as I mentioned before, is not just the idea of authentication, but also preservation of this material and preserving the authenticated version of it. So we do that through a process involving distributed storage, where versions of this and pieces of this are stored on thousands of servers around the globe using a number of different protocols. And a lot of those are also connected to blockchains, where when people think about blockchains, again, they tend to think about some other things that have been in the news a lot in the last few years. But when we're doing it, a blockchain is simply a digital ledger. And once you write something to it, it cannot be changed. So we take that fingerprint, which is called a hash for those who are more technically inclined, and we store that on a number of different blockchains. I think we used 7 in all on this particular project. And so when you see a CID, a content ID, that's a number that helps people look this up and find the image as it's been preserved. Then we have these different chains of trust, which are certificates that are used. And when I say certificate, any entity or organization can create its own certificates. And so we have linked these images to Starling Lab's own certificates and to one for Rolling Stone, showing, because they were the publisher of this story, and showing what the who is standing by to attest that this is the original version of the image that came through our organizations. You have some obvious basic image details like dimensions here and what was the version that was output. Down here is additional metadata, which is about the preservation of all of this. So you can see here, we used an app called Starling Capture, which is what did that cryptography that I mentioned earlier to create the authenticated scan. We obscured some of this in terms of the exact details of this location on what is publicly published. We didn't give the exact coordinates of where we were with Ron, but if someone were to take a photo in the field with a camera and want to show exactly where they are, we can absolutely make that sort of information public. In this case, we set it to a larger geographic region to show that this was taken when it was scanned in New York. And then what follows down here are the various blockchains where this is registered. So some may be familiar to folks, some may be ones you've never heard of. It depends on your familiarity, maybe with Web3 in that space. Open timestamp is a protocol really just to establish date and time, exactly like it sounds, but that one is from Bitcoin, which I think a lot of people are likely familiar with. So we don't use that for a currency reason or a cash value sort of reason at all. We literally are just trying to establish the date and time, and they have a very consistent way of doing that. We also use a number of other ones here. You see Numbers, Avalanche, ISCN. These are all blockchains. And then once we put the hashes on all of those, we're also, as I said, storing the image in 3 different places, IPFS, Filecoin, and Storage, STORJ. And each one of these here has a different ID that can be used to help trace back this material and also be clicked on to identify more details about it. So this is actually having me download when I click on that. So I'm trying to see if I can find a good display here. Here we go. There's a content ID checker. So sometimes being blockchain, these can be very slow to load. So I won't waste everyone's time here, but if we spend a few minutes on this, eventually it would populate a lot more information about the preserved version of this and the preserved hashes.
And then, and when you say this is stored, you mean that this is on 3 other networks or conglomerations of servers or whatever. So if one goes down or ends up in a fire or whatever, there are other locations?
That's exactly right. And people often say, well, I've stored something on Google Cloud or Dropbox and it's in the cloud.
Right.
Well, it still has to be somewhere physically. Someone is running those servers wherever they might be. They could be a giant server farm anywhere. The example I like to use, I was running the front page of a news site when Hurricane Sandy hit New York. And our servers were in Battery Park, which, as many people know, flooded because of the storm surge. And I was on the phone with our engineers that evening, and they said, don't worry, we've got a backup of everything. And I said, great, where's the backup? And they said, it's in New Jersey. And I went, please don't tell me where I'm going to guess. And it was on the banks of the Hudson River directly across from Battery Park. And so when the storm surge hit, the river flooded, both sets of servers got knocked out. So the idea of the protocols that we used is that they are as decentralized and distributed as possible. And so literally bits of these photos now, and they're scattered about, are on thousands and thousands of servers around the globe. And so that creates a more resilient form of storage. And using the cryptography, when you bring them all together, it then reestablishes which is the original version.
Is it fair to say that at the foundation of this, the moment in which it's scanned, and you talked about having to attest to the veracity or whatever, that's really one of the most crucial issues, that Ron has to be there with the original slide to say, this is the original slide, and it's not had work done to it. And then that is what is being locked down. And kind of in association with it, there's a question from Ted in the audience, which I think is a very good one. What happens? Do you have to keep that original slide, the physical object, to ensure that, as it were, the chain of veracity that is built on it also remains secure? In other words, is there a protocol for looking after Ron's original slides from which those scans have been taken that is necessary to ensure that this is as true as it can be? Or is this process of scanning, signing, distributed networks, etc., overcoming that issue of what happens to that original slide?
A great question. So we think about this at the lab in terms of information being downstream and upstream. So we try and get to the earliest point that information enters that stream. With digital cameras today, that's easier than ever, and so we can think about it there in terms of the software, the firmware, the hardware, even in the future ways of getting authenticity information baked into the sensor of the camera, imprinting watermarks, all sorts of different things. It can get really kind of whiz bang fancy tech. It's cool stuff. But with film, it's definitely more challenging. And so the best thing that we can do on anything today with something that is in film is to get to one of the original slides as it was taken and physically preserved. And so the fact that Ron had preserved his work was a critical component of this story. And being able to go to that really made a big difference. Now, someone can attest to a version of it maybe that's 10, 15 years later, but the more original, the better. And at the end of the day, humans are always going to be involved, I think, in some level in these processes. So the closer we can get to the original, the better. And the people who were most likely to be able to remember and recall who can be involved and whose testimony can be preserved and authenticated now, the better.
Right. But also, Adam, weren't you also with, I don't think with this photograph, but I think with one or two others, you were also cross-referencing street signs and graffiti on walls with other photographs that I didn't take to basically prove that I was telling the truth, that this is where these photographs were taken. Because I think it's also like, yes, with analog, it comes down, and even with digital to some degree, it comes down to the photographer, which is good, assuming the photographer is above board and has no intention of misleading the audience. But when it's versus digital, where there's no coordinates, no GPS, no nothing, how do you then say these photographs are true? It becomes very can become very sketchy.
That's exactly right. So there's a couple of things that we did with this. You see two more of Ron's photos here. Well, one that we've been looking at a lot, which is the image towards the right. And so a group went out to the city, to Bijeljina, and took photos of this wall, which is still up. And so those photos have the GPS coordinates showing exactly where it is. And I'm forgetting the exact number off the top of my head, but one of the other things in terms of the distance with this photo on the left, this is a hospital. And the soldiers were going through the hospital. Ron took a number of photos from inside of it, and also this one on the outside. And we used satellite imagery to forensically look at the exact location of this. Now, Starling's emphasis on all this is more on the origination of the original asset itself. But in this particular case, as just part of the investigative process, we wanted to be extra certain about this. And so using modern satellite imagery, I forget the exact number, but I want to say it was like 547 feet between the photo on the left here and the photo on the right. And that is obviously not using GPS data from the camera because there was none at the time. But there's obviously a proliferation of material. And so the role of fact checkers becomes important. And there's a wonderful community out there, people who work very hard to try and authenticate those exact sorts of details. And so we use some of their techniques in looking at this photo on the left and using satellite imagery overhead to identify what were these like awnings. This is a circular driveway here, the location of the stairwell, the types of windows. And in fact, there's even an older photo here. This photo, I think, is from roughly, maybe it's the 1930s or so, but it was from a library book about the city and showing, the architecture and the way that, the overhangs that are on these buildings. So it's always helpful when there's more than just one image. And of course, in this situation, there were quite a few additional images. And Ron provided these additional ones, which were also, used to help authenticate and preserve the entire collection.
So some of these images, Ron, were additional ones that you had taken. I mean, I presume also in the film sequence itself, there are images before this one and after this one that may be in this general location. Were they used as a sequence to add veracity to the individual photograph? We've lost your sound there, Ron.
Oh, I think you're on mute, Ron.
The last book that I published, called Shadow of Memory, I took photographs that had never been seen before from different events within the war in the former Yugoslavia. So from this day, I did basically like a grid of all the photographs around all the main images to kind of fill in the gaps, including like photograph of the soldier on the motorcycle, or some other photographs. If you actually go to this photograph, go back to the two women crying. This actually just happened within the last week, that I was contacted by a doctor from the hospital who had never seen this photograph before, and said he's never seen these women again after that day.
Wow.
Yeah, which is
So 30 years on, you were contacted by a doctor who remembered that moment.
who just saw the photograph, who was there that day.
Right.
I don't think I have a photograph of him, but he said these two women, they never saw these women again.
Right. So there we're getting to eyewitness testimony, accounts like that, which are being used to build out the story, as it were, and build out the veracity of this image.
Yeah, which is, goes back to, again, what the power of photography and what happens after time. And as you referenced earlier, photography, or certainly this photograph, has kind of taken on its own life.
Yeah.
And one of the things that I've done, which mimics some of the things that was done in the Rolling Stone piece, but also goes off into other directions, is that Lauren Walsh and I are co-directing a documentary called Biography of a Photo. And we're looking at this photograph from Bosnia and another photograph from Panama that has similar repercussions. And basically doing a biography of the image, like the day it was born, and then everything that's happened to it in the course of the last, Panama was 89, so the last 34 years, and this one 32 years, or 33 years, and all the different kind of impact that the photograph has created from this one instance. And the photograph has become one of the definitions of how a photograph becomes iconic is that the photograph has to leave its original place that it was created as a news photograph and become parts of other things like culture, politics, conversation, social media. All these different things become iconic. We use the word iconic very casually, but there are not a lot of photographs that actually fulfill that definition in the history of photography. And we believe that this photograph is one of them. Advertising, kind of becoming all T-shirts, all these different kind of things. And it's really, really quite fascinating. I think that one of the things that I found most interesting is that when I went to interview people at The Hague about the photograph, one of the researchers there said, "Did you know that when they opened up the tribunal, the War Crimes Tribunal for the former Yugoslavia, the prosecutor who gave the opening speech spoke about the photograph as being one of the inspirations for the creation of the War Crimes Tribunal." And then they pulled up the speech, and there it was. You can find it online. And it's just about, and while it's fantastic, okay, it's about my photograph, but it's not just about my photograph. It's just about this amazing power of photography. And one of the things that's become that we also follow in the film is that the daughter of Asya Shabanovic, Tifa Savanovic, one of the women who's lying here dying, her daughter has now taken this photograph, just the photograph itself, and brought it to the Serbian War Crimes Tribunal. And she is trying to indict the 3 soldiers in the photograph based solely on the evidence of the photograph. Now, the photograph has been used in a number of trials to indict and convict people of war crimes, but nobody in this photograph has been indicted. The main photographer, who's the quote-unquote DJ in the headline, he's been said to be a DJ in Belgrade. He's been identified as being, by many people, as being the person in this photograph, and she wants him to be arrested. And the photograph has now become part of a very kind of complicated situation about Serbia and who's responsible and who is part of the chain of command on who gave. There's all sort of kind of very confusing different things, and so it's again kind of this amazing thing about how photography can be involved in all of these different parts of the history of a war, the future of a country, political aspirations of different people, justice, what this poor family wants. They want there to be justice for the mother, and also her brother was also executed that day, and she wants justice, and she's using the photograph to try to achieve that.
Right. And Adam, you've just pulled up an article about that case itself.
I believe it's the same case that Ron is referring to. Often prosecutors will try and keep things close to the vest when they are investigating. But the one thing that has happened since the Rolling Stone version of the story published is that the prosecutors have confirmed to local journalists that they are investigating. They won't say much more than that. The suspicion here is that they are specifically investigating a gentleman who goes by DJ Max, Serjan Golubovic, who was named in some of those ICTY payroll records that surfaced, who was in witness testimony from the ICTY tribunal, referenced as having been associated with this incident and having been spanked for being in the photo itself. But that's the extent of the punishment that anyone is aware of, certainly, the extent of any accountability. There's been no, to anyone's knowledge, no formal indictments of any of these three individuals that you see. And, as came up, the individual whose name has been associated and who, certainly if I look at it, certainly, I mean, there's some striking similarities here. You look at the sunglasses, not many other people seem to be wearing those sunglasses. You look at the insignias, the badges, all of it. So this individual, Serjan Golubovic, who we believe is, possibly this person that we're looking at from behind here, the future career that shows the impunity that people can have. He's been playing music festivals the size of Coachella, not Coachella itself, but in Eastern Europe, music festivals the size of Coachella. And in fact, on Thanksgiving weekend in the U.S. Last year, we were working over that weekend. And Ron, I believe you were documenting with your team the same incident, or I wouldn't call it an incident, but that he was playing at a club in Novi Sad, Serbia, the second largest city, just a few months ago. And so we sent out a team with authenticated capture devices. We use some of these technologies to actually film him, DJ Max, performing at a venue in Serbia, just in the last few months. And so, again, continuing to show the concerns around this impunity, paired with the sorts of things that we had mentioned earlier in this conversation around the images that we have now seen of these people's lives on social media, where they've gone on to be hanging around with the Nightless motorcycle gang and living lives with no sense of repercussion for what transpired.
Right. Ron, there's a question for you from Ted Lieberman in the audience, he wants to know, why were you using slide film for the original photo? Was it to preserve the forensic integrity of the image, or did you have another reason?
No, it wasn't for that. It was just that magazines, agencies preferred at that time slide film. So we would never see our film. We would just ship canisters of film back to Paris or New York. Yeah. And that we did that probably until, I would say, until 1998, 1999 in Kosovo, where it was not really possible to ship film. And then everybody started shooting color neg, and then eventually switching over to digital. But it was a quality issue. Right. That was the main reason.
Adam, a question for you for the whole process of the digital investigation, given particularly in this case, the way it starts with a scan of Ron's image and attesting to the veracity of that image. What would happen if a bad faith actor scanned a manipulated image and then created a complex array of digital signatures on top of that? Would that secure something that was untrue, or is there a way to respond to that in the system?
It would secure it at a point in time. That isn't what necessarily makes it true, though. What's so special and what's so unique about this whole process is Ron's involvement. And Ron, being the photographer, the person who actually was there and witnessed this, being able to add his attestations to this. I mean, he's on video discussing this in this piece, which is so important to show that there's witness attestation. That's that human element that I was discussing before. If someone were to take a manipulated image and then to create all of this sort of authentication evidence around it, what that evidence shows is what that image was at a point in time. And that's where the blockchains come into this, because once a blockchain is written to, when someone adds a hash, they don't usually add an entire photo, they add the hash or the metadata. That can't be manipulated. There are thousands of other servers around the world that have witnessed what that blockchain said at that point in time. And so it becomes a permanent record. And so what it will do is establish that this is what it was on June 6, 2023. But if we have the version of it from last year, we can say, well, wait a minute, let's compare the two. And what's very important as part of this process is making comparisons, having points of reference. And so mapping all of this together becomes the next phase of a lot of this. And actually, that's some of the work that we're doing right now at Starling Lab, and part of our next phase of how we look at mapping these sorts of things together.
So that's, in essence, kind of a very detailed and complex process of corroboration using other forms of information and so on to connect to something, to make a whole that is stronger in terms of veracity than just the image itself.
It can be complex, certainly on the back end. I think the hope is that it becomes easy in the future. And there's ideas like perceptive hashing, where you're able to look at things that are similar and try and compare their effective fingerprints to show that they have a relationship and then compare. And I think especially as we look at think about services that people may use today, TinEye and PimEyes and Google reverse image search.
Right.
These are all ways that people often find very similar images to compare. How do you know which was the first one to be authenticated becomes a bigger question. And so just as technology has solved a lot of our challenges over recent years and created new ones, of course, we're hoping that as technology continues to evolve, that this process may actually be a lot easier for folks. And it may be that in the near future, people expect that whenever they're looking at a story, that they're able to click on an eye icon, that they're able to look for something. It maybe isn't that exact user experience and design, but that it is something similar to that. And that's what groups like the Content Authenticity Initiative are working on, and others as well, who are looking at trying to, I guess, really create a sense of media literacy. Ron, you use the term visual literacy, which I think is so important, that people come to expect to ask that question about the image. How do I find out more about its provenance? And so the technologies will facilitate that. But right now, it's a much more manual process, and it's a bit more challenging.
Yeah. So we're coming towards the end of our time, and I guess this is the kind of the next step, is kind of the question I wanted to conclude with, Adam. And that is, a huge amount of work has gone into, I mean, obviously Rolling Stone has done a huge amount in terms of the production of this as an immersive piece of reporting. But Starling Lab has done a huge amount of work actually setting up all these authentication certificates, etc. How sustainable is this? I mean, if Ron had hundreds of photographs, this would require a lot of people, I imagine. It would require a lot of effort, a lot of time. Going forward, how sustainable do you think this is for an increasing number of images that we will need to secure?
I would compare it to when you think about, real old time photography, where you've got, I forget the material, where it would actually burst with the flash and it would be like a small explosion. And then you had to like pull out the entire slide and put it back in. And now you hold up a digital phone and you can take a burst mode with dozens of photos in a second. The technology will continue to improve. So this was a very hands-on, very manual process for this particular story. So many of these technologies, it was the first time they were being implemented in the field, as it were, and made available to folks. Increasingly, I think that the photo community is making these tools more accessible and more user-friendly. And in fact, there are a number of apps that people can download on their phone right now. And even if their phone doesn't have what would be called a secure enclave and not be able to take a hardware level cryptographic signature, there are tools like numbers capture and proof mode, which you could download from any app store, whether you've got an iPhone or an Android, and use this to create a manifest with each one of your photos. So these are opt-in things. And so it's already available with the phone that's probably in your pocket right now if you download one of those free apps. and there will be more, I think, that gets integrated not just into phones, but a lot of hardware manufacturers are also working on solutions built into their cameras, which create more information and more secured versions of information, which add to the authenticity. So in the future, I think this becomes much easier, and it's already, while it might be difficult at a project of this scale right now and take a lot of resources and effort, I think that in the next couple of years, we'll see that it almost becomes the default for a lot of investigations.
Excellent. Ron, final word to you. You mentioned the documentary film that you're working on, the biography of a photo, this photo in particular. When are we likely to see that, and where are we likely to see that?
Where is still to be determined, but we're hoping we're in post-production now. So by next year, we'll certainly let everybody know, and maybe you and I can do another talk about some other aspects of this.
Yeah, sounds really good. Well, this has been a great discussion. Adam, I really appreciate your time. Ron, we always appreciate your time, and thank you to everyone in the audience for coming and for the questions. This is an issue we're going to return to on many occasions, because this whole question about how to establish veracity and how to link evidence together is, I think, always important, but increasingly important. So we'll probably be coming back to you later, but thank you very much for today.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
All right. Bye-bye, everybody.